how to take photos of stunning sunsets. Sunset photography can be challenging. The high contrast, fast-changing light, and warm, saturated tones experienced at sunset can make it difficult to decide on which camera settings to use. Learning sunset photography takes time and practice, but it doesn't have to be difficult. In this video, we'll discuss the best camera settings to use at sunset to make sure you get the best sunset photos possible. Tip number 1. Set your camera to aperture priority. 3 settings control exposure: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. While using manual mode enables you to set all 3 exposure settings on your own, it's often not the best approach when photographing sunsets. Because the quality of light changes rapidly as the sun sets, manually changing all the settings to achieve the correct exposure can be difficult. To get the right exposure with ease, set your camera to aperture priority. In this mode, you set the aperture and ISO while the camera adjusts the shutter speed for optimal exposure. Using aperture priority enables you to retain full control over the depth of field. This means you'll be able to keep most of your frame in sharp focus to capture that perfect sunset. Tip number 2. Use a large f-stop. Unless your goal is to create a blurry background, your sunset photo will likely benefit from a narrow aperture or a large f-stop. Using a large f-stop enables you to capture your scene in great detail. It also allows you to create the sunstar effect you typically see in sunset pictures. To create a sunstar, set your aperture from f16 to f22. Otherwise, depending on the amount of light available in your scene, set your f-stop anywhere between f8 and f11. Keep in mind, using a narrow aperture means letting in less light through the lens. If you're an aperture priority, this will prompt the camera to choose a slow shutter speed as a way to compensate. To avoid camera shake from slow shutter speeds, use a tripod. If you prefer to shoot without a tripod, set your ISO higher for faster shutter speeds. Tip number 3. Keep your ISO as low as possible. Raising your ISO will allow you to make your images brighter by amplifying the data recorded by your sensor. But it will also amplify the presence of noise in your image, so you'll want to use the lowest value possible. That said, don't be afraid to raise your ISO if you must. An image with a little noise is always better than a blurry or underexposed one. Tip number 4. Shoot bracketed exposures. Sunsets produce scenes with high contrast or high dynamic range. Dynamic range is the ratio between the lightest and darkest elements in a picture. During sunset, this gap tends to increase, making it difficult for your camera to capture the details of your scene adequately. When this happens, you'll need to choose between properly exposing your highlights or shadows and leaving one incorrectly exposed. To get around this, you can choose exposure bracketing. Most cameras have an automatic exposure bracketing (AEB) setting that allows you to take multiple exposures of a scene and blend them during post-processing. You can adjust the number of shots you take based on how many underexposed and overexposed images you'll need. For example, if you want to create 3 bracketed images, set your setting to a 3-shot AEB. This setting will give you 1 underexposed, 1 overexposed, and 1 properly exposed image. If you want to take 5 bracketed images, set your setting to a 5-shot AEB. This will provide you with 2 underexposed, 2 overexposed, and 1 properly exposed image. A tripod plays a vital role in this technique, as it will allow you to seamlessly blend these images later in post-processing. To blend these bracketed images, you can use HDR software, which will automatically do it for you. You can also do it manually by blending your images in Photoshop using layers. Photoshop layers will allow you to selectively choose the elements you want from each photo and combine them into one picture. Whichever method you choose, exposure bracketing and image blending will enable you to create an adequately exposed image, even in high contrast scenes. Tip number 5. Expose for highlights. If you're unable to bracket your images or prefer not to, exposing for your highlights is a good alternative. When you're shooting high-contrast scenes, exposing for the highlights will allow you to preserve as much detail in your image as possible. This is true even if it leaves the rest of the image dark or underexposed. Most modern cameras are so powerful you can almost always recover the rest of the digital information using editing software. In addition, slightly underexposing your pictures can help give the sunset colors in your image a richer, more defined look. To expose your highlights in Aperture Priority Mode, use Exposure Compensation. Exposure Compensation allows you to adjust your exposure without changing your exposure settings. If your highlights are too bright or overexposed, decrease your exposure compensation to a negative value. Conversely, if they are underexposed, increase your exposure compensation to a positive value. When adjusting exposure, remember that it's okay to leave some elements overexposed. This is expected, especially around your light source. Tip number 6. Use your histogram. A common way photographers figure out proper exposure is by using evaluated metering. In evaluative metering, your camera measures exposure by averaging the brightness of your entire scene. Although this works well in evenly lit scenes, it's not always as effective in high-contrast scenes such as sunsets. A more effective way to measure the exposure in sunset photography is by reading your histogram. While this takes more time than using evaluative metering, it will give you a more accurate measurement of exposure. To create properly exposed images, your histogram should be in line with the elements and lighting in your scene. If you are taking a picture of a silhouette with little detail, your histogram should mainly comprise of shadows or skew to the left. If you are taking a photo that has more detail, then your histogram should be comprised of mostly midtones and highlights, or skew to the right. Tip number 7. Shoot in RAW. Unless you don't intend to edit your photos, I recommend shooting with a RAW format. Compared to JPEGs, RAW files have a higher bit depth, which means they give your images a wider range of tonal values. This is important, especially for scenes with a high dynamic range. The wider tonal range, the more accurate brightness can be. A RAW file also has a larger color gamut. Whereas an 8-bit JPEG image only translates into 16 million possible colors, a 16-bit RAW image can have a total of 281 trillion possible colors. This will give you more flexibility in post-processing to adjust the color temperature or the white balance of your image. If you don't plan on editing your images, then perhaps JPEG is the best route for you. Unlike JPEGs, RAW images appear unfinished or dull if left unedited. Consequently, you'll need to make certain adjustments to RAW images before they are ready for presentation. Bonus tip: stay late. Try not to pack your gear and leave the scene too early. Sometimes the best light will unfold just after the sun disappears into the horizon. Don't stumble near the finish line. Practice patience and you won't be disappointed.